This video is all about what to do if your car turns over but won't start. If you are faced with a situation where your car normally runs, but for some strange reason that day it just turns over but doesn't want to fire, there is a very good chance that the engine is flooded, i.e. you've dumped too much fuel into the cylinders and the spark plugs are wet and failing to ignite. On a modern car like the Audi A4 and many others for that matter, the engine will often flood if you move the car a short distance. So you're turning the key, the car wants to start but it never quite fires up. In that scenario, you can get around that problem by putting your foot all the way to the accelerator and keep cranking the car, and eventually there'll be a puff of black smoke from the back and the car will actually start. We have done a video on that subject which has been viewed almost 200,000 times, and whilst that may work for a modern car like an Audi A4, it won't help us with this Mercedes that we're working on. Just before I move on and tell you why this particular car wouldn't start and what we had to do to get it running, I'm just going to touch on a few common reasons why some other cars turn over but they don't start. This beautiful 1976 280SL D Jetronic Mercedes was my first ever car, and it's only ever not started once, and that is because the fuel pump relay stopped working. For that reason, I always carry a spare fuel pump relay. They're only a few pounds from Euro car parts, and I'll quickly show you where they're located on this particular car. On the early R107s, the fuel pump relay is in the fuse box, and it's the top fuel relay just up there, right in the top. The fuel pump relay on later Mercedes looks slightly different and is located in a different place, and if you're not able to carry a spare one of those, it's worth carrying a spare piece of wire that fits into the fuel pump relay slot. You can bridge 2 pins of the fuel pump relay to cause your pump to run continuously, and that will get you home in an emergency. On a car with a carburetor like our Fiat 500 and our Fiat 238 van, these cars will almost never start if they've been sitting for several months, and that is because the fuel is either run back down the fuel lines into the fuel tank or it's evaporated from the carburetor. In the case of our Fiat 238, you can actually see that there is no fuel in the fuel filter here, so if you just put the key in the ignition and started cranking the engine, the battery would run flat long before you ever had fuel sucked up here from the small mechanical fuel pump on this vehicle. So to get round the problem of turning up for the first camping trip of the year only to find that the van won't start and then flattening the battery, what we do is we carry a Mitivac vacuum gun, and we will disconnect this fitting here, connect the vacuum gun to it, give it some pumps until we can actually see the fuel in the filter, and then we will try starting the vehicle. So I'm just going to pump until I see fuel in the fuel filter, and then you can just see the first fuel getting in the fuel filter there. If I was to try and start this van without doing that, we would just simply flatten the battery. And now, having not tried to start this van for about a year, we should find that it starts straight up. Just before we move on from this van, another reason your vehicle might not start is if you've got a snapped timing belt. That happened to us with this vehicle and indeed our vehicle in Australia. And the symptom of that is that the vehicle turns over but revs much higher than expected, and that's often the sign that you've snapped the timing belt or chain. On these vehicles, it's not a tragedy. We once did that on our Ferrari and it cost us a small house to have the engine replaced. If your car runs fine when it's warm but has trouble starting, especially when it's cold, the first thing to do is to check that the cold start injector or cold start valve is actually spraying fuel. The easy way to do that is simply to remove it, turn the engine over and see if any fuel comes out of it. We did a whole video when this Pagoda had a problem starting. It was being used in the Netflix series The Gentleman, and the problem was it wouldn't start when it was cold, and the reason was the terminals on the cold start injector here were dirty, and therefore the cold start valve wasn't getting any voltage. The only other time this Pagoda has let us down was when the fuel pump fuse blew, and that lives behind here, and the symptoms of that is that your car will run for 5 or 10 minutes, then it'll die, and you'll leave it for 5-10 minutes, start it up again, it'll run, and then it'll die. And if that is your symptom, then check your fuel pump fuse. We were once driving through the outback of Australia and found a car broken down there, and that was exactly his symptoms. And I said, have you checked the fuel pump fuse? And when we took the cover off the fuel box, there was a hornet's nest inside there, which was what his problem was. Last but not least, just before we get on to this particular car, why it wouldn't start, what we had to do to start it, just check that your car's actually got sufficient fuel in it. When we originally started to try to start this car, I had fuel in it, but it simply wasn't enough to get the fuel pressure to the right level. And similarly, we once led our van in Australia, Toyota Hiace, to somebody, and they parked it on a hill with not a lot of diesel in it. And when we came to start it a few months later, the van wouldn't start, and we had to put several jerry cans of fuel into it to get it started. So do make sure that your vehicle's got enough fuel in it to actually get started. The reason this 280SL D Jetronic didn't start the day after it actually did start, after we'd reinstalled all the fuel system, was quite simply because the engine was flooded. The most common reasons for a D Jetronic Mercedes engine flooding, especially if the car has been sitting for a long time, is the trigger points underneath your distributor there may not be working correctly, or they may be dirty, or there may be grit between the points. The engine coolant temp sensor here may be faulty, and that coolant temp sensor can enrich the air fuel mixture by up to 300%. So it's a really important sensor. If that's not working, that can result in your car running very rough. The air temperature sensor here can enrich the fuel mixture by about 20%. So once again, it's important that that's working. That'll affect your idle. And then of course there is the maximum absolute pressure sensor, the D Jetronic, standing for Druck in German. If that's not working, that will also lead to, or can lead to, a rich condition in your engine. If you suspect that your engine is flooded, the thing to do is to take these spark plugs out and inspect them. That'll not only tell you if your engine is flooded, but also give the fuel a chance to evaporate out of the spark plug holes if your engine is indeed flooded. Now, before you take these spark plugs out on your car, especially a car where the spark plugs are vertically down like that, down holes, you must blow out and clean out the holes to make sure that no debris falls into the engine when you take the plugs out. To clean these spark plug holes, we're doing a two-pronged attack. We've just got this little air gun here attached to our Coke bottle, which we're compressing to 50 psi, and that is our compressed air. And then at the same time, we're running a vacuum cleaner just with a bit of clear hose on it, and hoovering up all those little bits that are blown about. It is not a 5-minute job cleaning out those spark plug holes. We're using little swabs like this. You can see how many of them we've used, and this is just what came out of that spark plug hole. And the area that that came out of is where the crush washer of the spark plug should be sitting. So we're bending these at an angle, spraying on a little bit of brake cleaner, and just cleaning as best we can. So the next thing we're going to do is take the spark plugs out and change them, but let's just have a look at them first. These spark plugs, or at least this spark plug, looks wet, which basically is not surprising, because if the car isn't starting up, you're just firing fuel into that chamber and it's not igniting. So let's try new spark plugs and see how we get on. These are the spark plugs that came out the car. You can see we've got a mishmash here. We've got 4 NGK spark plugs, BP6ESs, which is actually the right spark plug for this car from memory. Some of them are in pretty poor rusty condition. And then we've got 2 Bosch super spark plugs, R0988 and R0885. The correct spark plug for this car is the Super R0853. It's been about an hour since we took these spark plugs out. All of them were wet from fuel, and you could see raw fuel glistening on the top of the cylinders. Now that will have had a chance to evaporate now, so I'm going to put the original spark plugs back in just to see if this engine fires right up. Okay, that is running a little bit better. What I forgot to do is actually check the voltmeter to see if we're at 14 volts, because I'm not convinced that the alternator is working. So let's see if this car will start again. We've got the voltmeter connected to the battery. Let's try and see if this car starts up and what voltage we get here. I've also changed the spark plugs for new spark plugs now, because the other spark plugs, some of them were quite old and they weren't all the same brand, and that could have resulted in that uneven idle. So we have ascertained that the alternator is putting out a voltage, but that voltage changes as you rev the engine. One of the reasons the alternator here might not work is if the voltage regulator is knackered, and the voltage regulator on these alternators is actually built into the back of it, and is this thing here. This is the voltage regulator here. It's almost impossible to tell just by looking at them whether or not they're working. Sometimes you can see that these bushes here are badly worn, but this one here has got signs of corrosion. But I can tell that somebody has been in here before, not least because there's one machine screw and the other is just a self-tapping screw that someone's rammed in to hold it in place. So we will go ahead and order another one of these, and in the next video do a video on the alternator, how it works, what the wiring is, and whether or not a new voltage regulator will fix our alternator.